In this class, we're talking about professions of faith. I remind you sort of the setting. There's just a lot of discussion about how a person is saved. And a lot of times people talk about, I've even heard people say, you just got to pray the sinner's prayer. Well, saying a set of words doesn't save anybody. And by the same token, you can't say a person is saved because they say a certain prayer, and you can't say a person's not because they didn't. And this is what we look at when we think about professions of faith in the Bible. I want us to see how is it that a person first both experiences and then voices faith. Last week we looked at Samuel, and we saw Samuel as a child experiences and voices faith. How does he experience it? Well, God comes to him, and his mom had prayed for him. She'd given him to the Lord. He was being reared literally in the house of the Lord, in the tabernacle with Eli, the high priest. And God came to him, revealed himself to him. Samuel at first didn't understand, and Eli told him, when he comes again, you say, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And man, that act of faith and obedience, I believe, is Samuel's profession of faith. Speak, Lord, your servant hears. And then he acts on what God tells him. God says, here's the message I want you to give to Eli. And he gives that message. And it says, from that point on, all of Israel knows that he's a prophet of God. So Samuel comes to faith in God at a very, very young age. And his life bore witness that his faith was genuine. Again, ultimately, the only proof of salvation is perseverance. You can't know simply because somebody says it. And there are people who say it, even seem quite sincere, but then later on, they vanish. Their faith vanishes. It's not that they had genuine faith and then lost it. They never had genuine faith. And so we're looking at characters like that. I wanted us to look at the second character I want us to notice is somebody that is fairly contemporary with Samuel. He predates Samuel by just a little bit, but they're from the same period, the time of the Judges. Now, the book of Judges is a book filled with just a lot of awful things. There's a very dark humor. God often seems like, the only time God sort of makes an appearance in Judges to the people is when they cry out to him. They're being oppressed. They're experiencing terrible oppression from the Midianites or the Philistines or some other group around them. And after they're being oppressed, they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, not a king that they all recognize as the leader, but a judge, someone who is something of a deliverer, something of I would say an enforcer. And the book of Judges shows us there's a series of these judges that come up. I believe more space is devoted to Samson than to any other judge in the book of Judges. Possibly Gideon, but I think Samson gets more ink. And I'm going to just read about his birth and then sort of summarize the story as we go through it. But then we want to concentrate on chapter 16, which is really the end of his life. So in chapter 13, verse 1, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, you see a lot of different enemies in the book of Judges. And Samson has to deal mostly with the Philistines. The Philistines are from Philistia, so north of Israel, along what is now modern-day Lebanon. The Phoenicians and the Philistines, really the same people. They were originally seafaring people. They built ships, they sailed, they went around, but a group of them came down into Canaan and settled there. So they are ethnically tied to the Phoenicians that are above, to the north of Israel, but basically they're building settlements, the way of sort of taking over the land. And they're the oppressor that you see highlighted in the life of Samson. You see this verse 1 of chapter 13 is sort of repeated over and over in the book of Judges. The people cry out to God, God sends a deliverer, and God delivers them, and then they forget God, and they fall into sin, and God allows them to be oppressed once again. So verse 1 of 13 is showing us, now here's the start of a new cycle. Well, the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So 40 years they're oppressed. What does this oppression look like? Well, basically, they rob you. They take your stuff. They enslave your children. They let you plant your crops and tend to your crops, and at the time you harvest your crops, they come and they take them away from you. So you just picture, every little town has to be prepared for war, and the Philistines are really a warrior people, and they knock down walls, they take what's stored in barns, they rape, they pillage, all the bad stuff. And God allows them to have their way with Israel for 40 years. Now, this itself is a sign of Israel's disobedience, because when they came into the land, God told them to drive out all the enemies, and they stopped short of that. After each of the tribes got their land, they didn't go help the other tribes finish driving out the enemies, and they just allowed these settlements to remain. And so you've got around the Israelites, Midianites and Philistines and people who worship different gods, and they cause Israel a lot of trouble. So verse 2 tells us, now the camera goes from the wide angle. We're seeing the people of Israel sinning and God allowing the Philistines to oppress them. Now it zooms in on one man. There was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Okay, interesting language on a lot of levels. What do you notice here? Well, if you're familiar with the scriptures, you notice that this has some things in common with the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist, that John the Baptist is dedicated as a Nazirite. And and by the way, this statement, when an angel declares that you're going to have a child and he's going to begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines, man, what a statement of incredible promise and hope. In the darkness of Israel's oppression by the Philistines, man, here's this glimmer of hope. And so at the beginning, and here's a barren woman, she can have no children. An angel appears to her, announces that this child is going to be born. Man, this fills us with hope, but we've been set up. We've been set up here by the author is giving us this hope, and this hope is going to be squashed because this kid is going to be a major disappointment. There's just no other way of saying it. Here he has been, she's told to observe, while she's pregnant, she's to observe the rules of the Nazirite. no alcohol. She's not to do anything to make her unclean. And he says, you're going to bear a son. Don't drink wine or strong drink. Eat nothing unclean. This child is special. He's going to be a Nazirite. And notice the verb, he's going to begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. There's not a promise that he's going to do it. He's going to deliver them. He's going to begin. He's going to begin the process. And the woman came and told her husband, a man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God. Very awesome. I didn't ask him where he was from. He didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. I just want to point out, don't confuse the word Nazarene, which means somebody from Nazareth, and Nazirite, which means someone who observes this very specific special vow. Not to, they don't cut their hair. They don't do anything that makes them ceremonially unclean. They can never go near a dead body. They can never drink wine or any alcohol. And they are separated and unto the Lord. I'm not sure about this, but I think an implication is that they don't marry. They don't marry. Certainly John the Baptist doesn't. But if they can never be ceremonially unclean, a wife is routinely unclean because of her menstrual cycle. And I'm trying to think if anyone who took a permanent Nazirite vow, I don't think there's any record of them being married. So Samson's going to violate all of that. He's going to break every single rule. And Manoah prayed to the Lord, O Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come again to us and teach us what we're to do with the child who will be born. God listened to the voice of Manoah. The angel of God came again to the woman as she sat in the field. But Manoah, her husband, was not with her. So the woman ran quickly and told her husband, behold, the man who came to me the other day has appeared to me. And Manoah arose and went after his wife and came to the man and said to him, are you the man who spoke to this woman? And he said, I am. And Manoah said, Now when your words come true, what is to be the child's manner of life, and what is his mission? Now, boy, that's a great question for a parent to ask, isn't it? The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat of anything that comes from the vine. Neither let her drink wine or strong drink or eat any unclean thing. All that I have commanded her, let her observe. Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, please let us detain you and prepare a young goat for you. And, you know, that he wants to honor the angel, and the angel consumes the fire, consumes the offering, and they fall on their faces. Verse 21, the angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and to his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord, and Manoah said to his wife, we shall surely die, for we've seen God. But his wife said to him, if the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering at our hands. Verse 24, the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. The young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. That's up in the north of Israel, near the source of the Jordan River. Now, chapter 13 is a chapter filled with hope. This child has been given by God supernaturally, and the child is to be dedicated to the work of the Lord. His mission is to begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. And now look how it begins to go south. Chapter 14. Samson went down to Timnah. At Timnah, he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. Boom. Meet Samson. That's him. All this promise, God blessed him. We're going to learn he has supernatural strength. But the first time he speaks, he's saying, get me what I should not have. I think it's questionable that he should have a woman at all, but it certainly is not questionable at all that he should have a Philistine woman. His mission is to deliver Israel from the Philistines, and here he is wanting to marry them. And God has commanded, in the law of Moses, he told them, don't you take a wife to yourself from the surrounding tribes. And yet here Samson sees, he lusts, and he demands that his parents get her for him. His father and mother said, hey, isn't there a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people? You got to go take a wife from the Philistines? Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Wow. I mean, again, I'm always impressed when authors tell so much with such an economy of words. And there it is. We know so much about Samson from that one line. Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Now, what's the theme of the book of Judges? There was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now, here's Samson, whom God has raised up to deliver them. And he's going right along with everybody else. He's doing that which is right in his own eyes. And then you've got the story of his father trying to get her for him, but look at verse 5. Let's see how one by one he breaks all the rules. Verse 5, behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. Now, again, what's he doing? He's going back down to Timnah to get his girlfriend, and on the way, he wants to see the carcass of the lion that he killed with his bare hands. Now, what's he doing? I mean, obviously, he's displaying pride. Secondly, he's breaking the rule, the Nazirite vow. He's not supposed to go near any dead body of any kind. And yet he turns aside to go to see the carcass of the lion. Behold, there's a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. So he gets some of this wild honey out of the carcass of a lion, and he gave his mother and father some of that, and they ate. He didn't tell them he didn't tell them, he got it out of a carcass. And there you have his father throws sort of the wedding feast for him to marry this young woman. And there at the wedding party, they're drinking. And Samson says, I tell you what, I'll make a bet with you guys. I'm going to give you a riddle. If you can solve the riddle, within the 7 days, they're going to have a 7-day party. If by the end of the wedding party, you can solve the riddle, I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you can't tell me the answer to the riddle, then you give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said, okay, deal. Put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them in verse 14, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Now, by the way, that's a riddle you can how could anybody solve that? It's only something he saw. It's his personal experience. I mean, Samson has given them a truly unsolvable riddle. If he never tells the answer, there's no way they can get it right. But Verse 15, they said to Samson's wife, on the fourth day, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is. Now, let me just point out, this points back to Genesis chapter 3. This is exactly like Satan coming to Eve, separate from her husband, trying to get her to do something that will divide them. And the Philistines, on the fourth day of the wedding feast, come to her and, hey, let's make a side deal. Now, where's her true loyalty going to be? Is she going to be loyal to her husband, or is she going to be loyal to her people? And they say, but they threaten her, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And Samson's wife wept over him and said, you only, and look at this, so she pulls out all the tools. She goes to Samson, you only hate me. You don't love me. You put a riddle to my people, and you've not even told me what it is. And he said, I've not even told my mother or father. But she keeps crying, and 7 days of their feast last. On the seventh day, he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people, and the men of the city said to him on the seventh day, before the sun went down, what's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion? And he said to them back, and by the way, notice in the ESV, they put this like in verse, because in Hebrew it is poetic. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. He knows exactly what happened. Nobody could know the answer to that unless they got it from him. And he gave it to her. So he knows exactly what. And so what does he do? He goes down to Ashkelon, which, by the way, has been in the news. Ashkelon is down there right near the Gaza Strip, and that area down in the south part of Israel. He goes down to Ashkelon, and he kills 30 Philistines, and he takes their clothes and gives it to the men to whom he posed the riddle. And the same kind of thing happens in chapter 15. Samson will fight the Philistines, and then he's in league with them. There's a lot of different things happen. We won't take time for all the stories. I want to talk about him, and then we want to look at whether or not this guy is ever saved. He's a bundle of contradictions. I mean, Samson is bold before men, yet he's weak before women. This woman, and then the Delilah part of the story yet to come. The Spirit of God is upon him. It says so several times. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Yet he repeatedly gives way to the appetites of the flesh. He is born and called upon to declare war on the enemies of God, yet he fraternized and fellowshiped with God's enemies. He fought the Lord's battles by day, but he broke the Lord's commandments by night. His name, Samson, means literally sunshine, sunny. And his name speaks of light. But his life ends in darkness, having his eyes gouged out. It's amazing that this guy could soar so high, have such immense strength, and yet go so low. He's born with this incredible heritage. He's the product really of a miraculous birth announced by an angel. He's to be a Nazirite. He's to exhibit all the signs of the Nazirite, not cutting his hair, not drinking alcohol, not going near a body or anything unclean. He's anointed with the Spirit of God, and he had tremendous strength. And it says the Spirit of the Lord would come upon him. He can tear a lion apart. He can defeat 30 men single-handedly. Later on, in one day, he kills 1,000 of God's enemies with a whited jawbone from the field. On another occasion, he takes the city gates of Gaza, post and bar, and he put them on his back and carried them up the hill and left them there. I mean, just sort of show your walls have no power over me. I mean, he just literally picks the gate up, carries it up the hill, and leaves it. He kills this lion with his bare hands. When you think of Samson, like, what do you think of? If you picture Samson, what do you picture? Most of us would probably picture, like, I don't know, the Incredible Hulk with regular skin and long hair. But we typically, in children's Bible story books, you see Samson pictured as some big muscular guy. That's usually what we think of. But he didn't have mountains of muscles and bulging biceps, because otherwise, you don't ask a guy with big biceps, what's the secret of your strength? Well, you know the secret of his strength. He works out. He's built those muscles. Samson looks like a guy that shouldn't have that kind of strength. And that's why Delilah keeps asking him, what's the secret of your strength? It's not obvious. It's not apparent. How can a guy that looks like you do that? His strength was in the power of God. The Holy Spirit of God would come upon him. Don't ever make the mistake of thinking that his strength was in his hair either. His hair was only a symbol of that strength. His separation before God was the secret of his strength. And he's an illustration and a lesson to those of us who need the spiritual strength of the Holy Spirit in our lives. We need the Holy Spirit to come upon us. We need the strength to defeat God's enemies, not physically but spiritually. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And we can't do that in our flesh. We need to show a spiritual strength that causes people to say, what's the secret of your strength? Well, it's the Spirit of God. Not only was Samson spiritually strong and physically strong, he's mentally strong. He had a very keen mind. He's very witty. He loved a joke. He loved a turn of phrase. And he had a way with words. He loved little riddles and conundrums. Throughout the story of Samson, you see him speaking in rhyme or little couplets and verses. I have an idea that he was really a fun guy to be around when he wasn't just being a jerk. And because he's playful, he has a way with words. His name, Sunshine, sort of probably described him. He could brighten a room by entering it. And with so much going for him, it makes the story that much more tragic. I mean, the absolute promise of chapter 13 gives way to massive disappointment. We're expecting this child of promise who's a Nazirite and who's been given this mission by God to at least begin well and then maybe decline. That doesn't happen at all, does it? Very first words out of his mouth. Get me that woman. I want her. It's right in my eyes. Do that for me. The way he speaks to his parents, the way he disregards God's law. Now, I want to point out something. We're talking about professions of faith. It's clear you are not saved by the dedication of your parents or your family. Samson had godly parents, and he's been announced by an angel, but he doesn't act like a saved man at all. There's nothing in him that shows any love of God, any reverence for God or his commandments. And so clearly, you're not saved by the dedication of your parents, nor are you saved by the performance of religious devotion. Don't ever mistake religion for redemption. Samson is a Jew, and he's a special Jew. He's a Nazirite. He has the right religion. This is the religion God gave to Abraham. But nothing about Samson looks like he's saved. And you're also not saved simply because you fight God's enemies. You might be rabidly anti-abortion. You might be against the LGBTQ plus agenda. You might have the right position about gender being binary and fixed. You might be right on a lot of things, but you're not saved simply because you oppose God's enemies. Never mistake conservatism for conviction. There are some people who think, if you're just politically conservative or religiously conservative, that means you're saved. But all that is what I call the faith of demons. Remember, James says, you believe there's one God? You do well. The demons also believe and tremble. See, belief itself, belief in a set of facts, commitment to an objective truth or reality, that doesn't save you. Samson has that. Don't mistake conservatism for conviction. If Samson proves anything, he proves it's dangerous to have power without prayer. And you don't see Samson praying. Samson doesn't say, Lord, help me defeat your enemies for your glory. Why does he fight the Philistines? It's because he's mad because they tricked his wife. He's not fighting the Lord's battle. He doesn't pray and ask God to give him insight. He's got power without prayer. Secondly, it's dangerous to have wit without wisdom. He's witty. He's got a keen mind, but he does not have the wisdom to use that mind for the glory of God. It's dangerous to have position without principles. Samson has been appointed by God as a judge of God's people. And what a lofty position. This puts him in the company of Deborah and Gideon and other of the judges. Samuel will be the last of the judges. Man, Samson is in great company, isn't he, by having this position? But he holds this position without any principles. He, again, giving no evidence whatsoever of salvation. It's dangerous to have the favor of God without faith. Maybe the most dangerous position you can ever be in is to have God's material and physical blessings without knowing God. See, people who have God's physical and material blessings think they don't need God, or they think God approves of them. Samson is incredibly blessed of God, but God doesn't approve of him or of his lifestyle. I want to warn you that there are three people wearing your clothes today. There's the person that you are, and there's the person you could be for God, and there's the person you will be if you take your eyes off of Christ. We can so easily mess up. I mean, man, it's just disheartening to see how easily, in one moment, in one bad decision, a ministry can be lost. A reputation can be demolished. Our influence with others can be completely taken away. We all need to stay so completely dependent on Christ and realize that if we have any strength at all, it's because of Him. If we have any wisdom at all, it's because of Him. And we need to walk in utter and complete dependence on Him. And I need the Lord. The last thing I ever want to do is rely in any gifting God has given me instead of relying on the God who gave the gift. Samson relies completely on the gift. He's relying on the strength. there's only one way to be saved, and that's to be saved by what? Faith. This is the message of the Bible, is we can say by grace through faith, but faith is required. The Bible says without faith it is impossible to please God. Now, is there anything in Samson's life that makes us think he has any faith whatsoever? Well, no. Even though he can defeat the Philistines, look at after he kills the 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey in chapter 15, look how he talks to God. Verse 18. Again, he doesn't pray before he fights the Philistines. And when he does pray, because talking to God is prayer, but look what he prays. Verse 18 of chapter 15. He was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, "You've granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" It's like, God, you owe me some water. Yeah, all right, you let me defeat these Philistines. You going to let me die of thirst now? That's the way he talks to God. And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned and he revived. Therefore, the name of it was called En Hakor. It is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So for 20 years, Samson operates this way. He relies on this incredible strength, the gifting God has given him, and he fights the Philistines when he wants to, and he's sort of the deliverer. He keeps the Philistines from abusing God's people. But now we get to chapter 16 after, it's like it's panned out again at the end of 15, 20 years pass. Now we get down to chapter 16. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. Okay, this scene, there's no build up to the bad part. It just, boom, there it is. He goes to Gaza. And by the way, Gaza is a Philistine city. And he goes and he sees a prostitute, and he has sex with a prostitute. And the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. So they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of the morning, then we'll kill him." But Samson lay till midnight. And at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gates of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. So they don't get him. They lay ambush for him. They can't get him. Verse 4, after this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we'll each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So, now again, we've seen this story before. Samson, the great strong man, falls completely weak to a woman who has a power of her sexuality over him. And she says to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound that one could subdue you." Now, for all of his brilliance, his wittiness, this is where you just realize around a pretty woman, a man's intelligence just goes down by about half. Now, by the way, that really is a scientific fact, that a man's intelligence decreases around a woman he's attracted to. They've had all kinds of studies of it. And it's, by the way, my excuse for being stupid. Samson is, she asked the most obvious question. Tell us the secret of your strength. What would it take for somebody to be able to subdue you? Well, why on earth would you ever tell that? And the Samson said to her in verse 7, well, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I'll become weak like any other man. Well, guess what they do? They do it while he's asleep. And she says, the Philistines are upon you. But he snapped the bowstrings as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Now, again, you just go, how dumb can he be? She's obviously trying to fish it out of him. They're doing whatever he says to see if it works, and it doesn't work. Why would he ever give her the truth? But this keeps going and going until, verse 15, she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart's not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times. You've not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. By the way, remember Jesus told the parable of the unjust judge? And it was like the judge, he wouldn't give justice because that was the right thing to do, but because of her persistence, he did what she asked. The unjust judge that Jesus speaks of certainly reminds us of Samson, doesn't it? And here's this woman, and she keeps asking him and asking him, and he just gives in. Because of her persistence, he said, he told her, look at verse 7, he told her all his heart. Now, he's never poured out his heart to God. He's never shared his heart with his creator and sustainer, but he shared all his heart with her. And he said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I've been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Now, I want to point out to you, I still stand by my statement that his hair is not the secret of his strength, even though he says that. I think it's simply the last of the Nazirite vows that had not been broken. So he's broken every other part of the vow. This is the only part of the vow that's not been broken, and he knows it. He drinks strong drink. He lies with women. He goes around carcasses. He's done everything else. The one thing he's not done is cut his hair. And so at least I've kept that. And when Delilah saw that he told her all his heart, she cut his hair. Is that what it says? No, you hear that. Often that's the way the story is told. But she brought in somebody to cut his hair. She didn't cut his hair. She called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up again. He's told me all his heart. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought all the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I'll go out as at other times and shake myself free. Now here's one of the saddest verses in all the Bible. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. Now think about this. By the way, one of Milton's great poems is called Samson Agonistes, and he describes this. Eyeless in Gaza, he treads the mill. And this, I remember my childhood Bible, there was a picture of Samson. Someone had painted Samson at the mill, a millstone in the middle, and instead of an ox grinding the grain, it was Samson, this blind Jew, just This is all what his day was filled with, just going round and round and round like an animal. But his hair began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, verse 23 begins the story of his death, and something happens to Samson. The lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand." And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." Now, notice, they are praising their god Dagon for giving Samson into their hand. And you and I know there's no truth in that whatsoever. First of all, Dagon doesn't even exist. Secondly, it was Samson himself who gave himself into their hands. But they're praising another god. And when their hearts were merry, that means when they've been drinking, they said, "Call Samson that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. So they've got this big temple of Dagon, and in the center, the roof is held up by these two center columns. And they made Samson stand right there in the center between these two pillars. And here's Samson, blind, but there's a boy who had led him out there by the hand. And Samson said to him, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, okay, other than his plea for water, this is the only time we see Samson pray. And look, there's no arrogant demanding of God. There's no telling God he owes it to him because he did such and such. He says, "Oh Lord God, please remember me." Where have we heard that? Well, that's the thief on the cross expressing faith. Just remember me. And please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my two eyes. And Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years. Now, this is a radically different profession of faith than Samuel. Samuel, as a child, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears," and his whole life is directed toward obedience to God. Here's Samson, knows all the right stuff, has every advantage, but he doesn't really acknowledge God in any meaningful way till his death. Faith sometimes comes after a life has been wasted, after great opportunities have been lost, after a lot of people have been hurt, after all other options have been exhausted. You know anybody like that? Do you know anybody who lived their whole life for themselves, squandering the gifts and blessings God gave them? But then when they're old, when they're about to die, then they turn to Christ. Some people put their faith in God just in time for eternity. Samson's one of those. Call it what you want, a deathbed confession, execution salvation. There's no question Samson's profession of faith is imperfect. It doesn't sound like a sinner's prayer. I'm uncomfortable with what Samson prays. I wish he'd said, Lord, let me avenge you of your enemies. He doesn't say that. He said, would you let me avenge them, me, my two eyes? His profession of faith is imperfect. It's still tainted with his own motive. But it is humble. Lord, remember me. It is trusting. For the first time, he knows God is the source of his strength, not his hair. And for the first time ever in his life, he is surrendered. Back in chapter 15, verse 18, he said, oh, you owe it to me to give me this water. Here, he doesn't plead, Lord, you owe me anything. Lord, would you just this once, let me have my strength. And he surrenders to God. Now look, God sees faith in flawed people. God sees faith in flawed professions. Because what God sees is faithful hearts. This is why sometimes, people if they make a stab at calling on God for salvation, they might, I've heard people say stuff that's not theologically correct. They don't understand yet. Samson's prayer is not the prayer that I would have coached him to pray, frankly. But God sees faith where we don't see it. You just look at Samson and Samuel, compare and contrast them. Both are privileged by their parents. Both of them come rather supernaturally, God blessing a barren woman to have a child. Both are dedicated by their parents to the Lord. But one trusted the Lord in childhood, the other in death. One used his life, one wasted his life. But both are in heaven by the grace of God. Now, can we be honest? That troubles some of us. We're scandalized by the grace of God that would give the same heaven to two men, one who devoted his whole life to serving God, and one who spent his whole life on horrible, selfish things, and yet at the very end of his life trusted God. But both of them are in heaven by the grace of God. Now, I want you to know that little part of us that resents God giving that kind of grace to a guy like Samson is the little self-righteous Pharisee in us that says, hey, wait just a minute. That guy doesn't deserve God's grace. So do you think you do? When we start judging God for whom he shows his grace upon, well, that you can't be more self-righteous than that. But I want you to see something. Hebrews chapter 11. And look at verse 32. What more shall I say? Now, this is the great chapter of faith. By faith, and it's sometimes called God's Hall of Fame, the Hall of Faith. And it mentions Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Joshua and Rahab. And then verse 32, what more shall I say? Time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned and sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Did you get what the author of the letter to the Hebrews is saying? He's saying all of these have in common not that they lived good, wonderful lives. In fact, he's telling us throughout chapter 11 that there's basically two tracks. That there are those that they received incredible physical blessings of God. There were others that were killed and tortured. Samson's sort of both. But they didn't receive the promise of God in this life, because the real promise of God, he said they couldn't receive it apart from us, meaning apart from that generation in which Christ appeared. That's the basis on which God shows grace. Samson's prayer, man, it's imperfect. His faith is imperfect. He's not a very satisfying character at all. And yet there he is in Hebrews chapter 11, right along Samuel. That's the scandal of the gospel, that one man could devote his whole life to God and get the same reward of heaven that another gets who trusts God only minutes before his death. Some reject the gospel precisely because of that. I ask you, would you reject a cure for cancer because it's given to people you don't think are worthy of it? This is the grace of God. I want to say, if you have a loved one that has wasted their life, and they're rejecting the gospel, they might even curse the name of God. Don't give up hope. Don't stop praying. Don't stop witnessing. A little faith gets the whole Christ. And you don't know how God will work even in the moment of their death to bring to their mind the gospel that's been shared with them many times. I'm pretty sure people observing the crucifixion of Jesus would never have known that one thief would go to heaven. And anyone observing Samson's life would not know that at the moment of his death is when he shows faith. But I would say to you, if you've never trusted Christ, man, don't count on anything. Don't waste another day. Put your faith and trust in him now. And if there's somebody that you're praying for, don't stop praying. Keep praying. I've told many times the story of Tanya's dad, my own father-in-law, but I will tell you one of the things that struck me about witnessing to him. I'll never forget when we took him down to Brazil. He was 83 years old when we took him to Brazil, and I'm out there in the jungle with him on the water. We're fishing, and I'm talking to him about the Lord. He's got nobody to talk to but me and David Hatcher. He can't speak Portuguese, and David and I are just pouring the gospel into him. And I just asked him, well, Gene, why wouldn't you? And he said, just as clearly as he possibly could, he said, what kind of a man would I be if my whole life I've lived my life for me, and now I'm old and not far from dying, and now I trust Jesus? What kind of man would I be? I said, Gene, you'd be a saved man. That's what kind of man you'd be. He didn't trust the Lord on that trip, but man, I think the seeds were planted that resulted in his salvation within 2 years of that. And the last 2 years of his life were very, very different because of the Lord. The Lord just knocked him down. He never walked again. He fell in his garden one day and he never got up again. Had to be in a wheelchair, had to be put in bed, out of bed, in the tub. But man, in that brokenness, he trusted the Lord. And he believed in the truth. Now, I look at his life and I go, wow, what he could have done for the Lord, what he could have accomplished for the Lord had he trusted the Lord as a young man when someone first told him the gospel. But you know what? He's in heaven. I told him on that trip, I said, Gene, you don't understand. I said, it takes as much grace of God to save a 7-year-old boy from all his future sin and potential sin as it does to save an 83-year-old man from the sin he's actually committed. It's all the grace of God. Salvation is of the Lord. Man, between the two, there's no question. I want to be a Samuel. I want my whole life to serve the Lord. But I'm grateful that God's grace can save even a Samson, someone who's wasted all their blessings, hurt many, many people, but find faith before they die. Praise God that God's grace doesn't save us based on whether or not we deserve it. He saves us simply because it glorifies him. And that is the hope and the heart of the gospel.